Okay.
So in our last discussion, one thing that I wanted to try to communicate was the the problems with solving any sort of problem is maintaining a learning atmosphere. We talk a lot about that, right? Like people learn through iterative assessments and things like that. And people are always trying to get some idea of how is it going. One thing I think is lacking and often important is some kind of a vision. Like, hey, this is what we want to do, right? And to keep that in some time frame that's achievable, so people don't get discouraged and get overwhelmed by too poor planning. And I think that's a whole different topic. But when it comes to AI, one thing that you and I both are amazed by are that a lot of things were expensive were cheap. I think that's always fun, right? Like a lot of things, a lot of hard work, such as analysts do from our last discussion, right, is kind of pretty easy for these systems to do.
Yeah.
Well, and when things change their economy, because I was just looking into good old Henry Ford and all this stuff, like the basic thing was he wanted to make cars cheaper, right? Now, he had to do a lot to make things cheaper, but once you make your cars cheaper, it's really hard to not benefit from either just the competitive environment, right? You're always competing against somebody else. If they're more expensive and you're less expensive and so on and so forth, at least for making products, right? When it comes to getting advice, I teach at a fancy university that charges you more, because we want to be perceived as, something elite or luxury. So cost isn't always the perfect measure. But when it comes down to actually utilizing these tools, I keep getting stuck. So I'm wondering if you could give me your opinion on what I might be missing architecturally, because I always feel like if I understood why things work, I can understand when they break.
And I think that the problem that is the hardest is probably integration, right? So I can pretty easily set up a pretty sophisticated generative AI system on whatever, some sort of a Kubernetes place online, which will be equipped with enough horsepower to run everything, and then maybe connect to a foundation large language model, maybe in some sort of a multi-cloud architecture, right? And I can start doing some pretty sophisticated things. That might include.
Can I unpack that? Because that's really what I'm having a difficulty understanding. So if I start somewhere, let's just say, and correct me if I'm wrong, having worked for SaaS and especially Salesforce, right? One of the best things you can do right now is already have all of your quote unquote data in one of these platforms, because then it's up to them. They can start to introduce some sort of efficiencies, right? So if you work on Monday.com, they could probably help you use AI in some manner because they have a context to the data that you shared with them. That context is pretty good because you've already cleaned it. Let's just pretend, right? I used to use a tool called Notion that was great, kind of a general database as well. But once things are structured, your problems are different. I'm talking about the new problems, and this is where I fall apart because I have a use case, but I'm trying to figure out how to do it.
And I think that's what that's what I meant. Probably, maybe not in integration, this kind of the backend stuff, but maybe more closer to your wheelhouse, which is the human-computer interaction, right? Like, okay, so I got a very intelligent question answering system. Now, what is the user actually supposed to look at, right?
You're skipping to the end. So let's before we skip to the end, yes, that's really where I kind of start there, but also give them what they need, because as far as I'm concerned, every single place I've worked ever, people just want free text search of the entire world of information and they want it to be delivered to them. Never has occurred, right? Like That just only works in Google land, right? It only works in some abstract way for these bigger companies. But every time you go free text search within Microsoft, we were just complaining about them, so I'll complain more, within their portal, or even I worked for Salesforce that didn't use Microsoft. Its free text search was terrible. Okay, so let's just say free text searches might be our method, because that is pretty comfortable as a human computer interaction device, right? That you're pretty good at talking or typing, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you could, it's a lot easier than other things. So now I'm trying to start with RAG. Now, forgive me because I don't want to, I might be confused. So let me see. In my mind, you've got two things. You've got your GPT model that's pretty much just a game. It's trained on being able to communicate. Let's put it that way. Like it knows how to communicate about stuff, and you can glean factoids from it. Like it isn't dumb. But it's trained in such a broad way sometimes that it can't be everything to everybody, but it's pretty good at basic ideas.
Yes, it is an engine, right? So it's an engine, although those factoids, probably you don't want them. So in most cases, those factoids that are in there will be outdated from the old, maybe a little bit kind of
good, right? It's not up to date.
Consider the hallucination in most cases, right? So you want RAG to actually use that foundation large language model as an engine, but all the data information comes from RAG, right?
Well, start there. Okay, so one component that is hefty and real and that you have to contend with is just this model, the language model, the ability to be able to take in and parse and talk, right? Like it's just its own, whatever this is in our diagram, right? It's its own thing. And there's a lot of models. We talked about them last week, but let's just pretend like, okay, that's one problem. The reason I bring up RAG is that my second problem is what do they call it? Unstructured files. I've got tens of thousands of them, right? That I made myself, right? And let's just throw in all the music I've ever listened to, or at least all the music that I like, let's pretend, is a library of a ton of stuff, right? And then there's another library of imagery, and probably in between there's a few other file types, but here's just a bunch of stuff. Now, I'm just a person, right? Let's say you took the enterprise and you could go in and say, okay, all those files you've got on your OneDrive or whatever ridiculous thing Microsoft wants you to do, we want all of those to be part of the knowledge base. Or let's just say, hey, we're going to just take marketing. Everything, every piece of thing you've ever created, we want that to be part of this RAG thing, right? Okay, I'm going to pause there because weird, right? Now tell me that that's not weird.
No. It's completely legit, right? So I think in the text world, absolutely yes. The problem disappeared. Everything that you typed, all the text documents, you load them into your RAG, and you have really in-depth, intelligent access to everything, right? So you can ask questions, summarize, or whatever.
Okay, just pause. So if I just go to all the emails sent at Chase Manhattan Bank, and I am the FCC, I just say, go look for fraud. And the RAG would come out and say, look, these people are scamming. These people, you see what I mean? Like, is that possible? Because
wait a second, right? So yes, so they will be there, but the definition of fraud, let's just remember that those foundation large language models are very intelligent 5-year-olds, right? So you have to define your problem, right? So sometimes it could be a question which will be like self-contained, like, hey, give me everything that is funny, right? So maybe that's gonna be something, or give me everything that is relevant to Mike. Right, so the large language model will perform reasonably, right? Now, in terms of fraud, perhaps you're gonna need a little bit of a definition, like define a fraud, give an example. But fundamentally, yes, the problem is solved. You're gonna get a pretty good response as long as it is text. Now, if we are going into multimodal, now let's say, give me all fraudulent, audio recordings, right, or something like that.
Okay.
Right? I think we're
Well,
gonna be better.
meetings are being recorded, right? And you could say, give me every meeting, because I can tell you a huge problem that I found, and you've probably found too, is the general forgetfulness, right? Like people forget what happened a couple weeks ago or a month ago. Isn't that fair, right?
Yeah. So RAG, in multimodal is going to be there probably next year. So it's just a different file type that needs to be vectorized and kind of handled, right? So
that's where I'm getting confused. Okay, so RAG is a proper term that a AI, that one cloud we just wrote, can leverage, right? It can use that in order to talk about something that maybe is very specific and not generic. Is that fair?
Yeah, RAG is kind of a search solution, right? So it will find something that is very, very close to the subject matter of the question.
So that's where I'm getting lost. How do I RAG my hard drive? Like how do you, because I started to look up this vectorization that got a little confusing to me. Like you kind of need to build using cheap or free tools. This is what's still weird, right? Like
there's a lot of open source, open source tools, right? So there's two things that need to happen, right? So you have your emails or your documents, right? You need to convert them into vectors, right? So that's the vector. The name of the vector is in the RAG world is called an embedding, but it's basically just a vector. There's some clever things happening during the vector creation, but at the end of the day, if you have like an email, that email becomes a vector. Maybe if this is a very long email, it's going to be divided into 3 vectors or 4, but still the framework handles that. So it will know that this is a chunk of your email, right? And then it will go to another email and another, right? So that's there, right? So once you have those vectors, you load them into a place that can handle them, right? So it's going to be a vector database. Then the beautiful thing about this that now you can very effectively search those vectors, and that's going to it's not going to be a keyword search, like type the keyword in only documents that have the word Mike will be returned, but it's a conceptual search, so that those embeddings are created in a way that basically compress information, so that there is going to be also kind of neighboring concepts present, and all that kind of intelligent search is now kind of very, very efficiently done, right? So you will retrieve an excellent quality relevancy of the document.
So on a commercial front, I'm guessing, let's see, Perplexity, they're doing this with the web, or because there's a few, and there's also Google experiments called I Want to Learn. There's a lot of experiments out there, and I'm just guessing that they have already started to RAGize a bunch of stuff out there, right? Like,
yes,
isn't that
absolutely? Yes. So OpenAI, everything that comes from those things is mostly probably embeddings that got retrieved and got submitted to the large language model as an addition to your question, because what RAG does is it's basically a query expansion procedure where you ask a question, you grab from RAG something very, very relevant, put that into a single package, send to the large language model, and then the large language model has plenty of relevant stuff to think about, and then respond to your question. And if you do it that way, then the large language model is not going to be very likely to look into its internal memory for answers, because it will have that metadata, that context that is relevant based on the very, very efficient search. Again, that search is such an important thing here, right? So the embeddings give you that relevant stuff, right? And then that's kind of gets packaged as context. So obviously without RAG, you can still have pretty good conversation, but with RAG, you will have contextual conversation to the emails, or to your hard drive, right? Or to the organizational database, or to something very specific that you can you can say, because in RAG you can also specific domains, right? So you can say, well, I mean, for this particular question, I want to look only at financial enterprise data, right? I don't want to know anything else, right? So in most cases you can kind of like limit the domain, but in also in other cases, even if you don't do that, we still have to remember that the retrieval is so accurate that you're probably still gonna get something that is relevant, right? So so this is beautiful. I mean, it's not a new concept. I mean, in information retrieval, the concept of intelligent search, not keyword search, but an intelligent search, which is kind of like some sort of a statistical trick on the text, so that you compress it and create those meanings, existed for 3 decades, if not more. I mean, one of the first papers that I read as a graduate student was on a paper on latent semantic indexing, and it was like way before the deep learning happened and way before the GPT happened. So I think that, but now it's kind of like integrated, right? Now we can do it
the
very
use case
efficiently.
is incredibly valuable, right?
Yeah.
So it's always been probably, wasn't there early AI was someone trying to teach the computer what things were and how things worked in the real world, and had millions and millions of data entry points to just try to describe the world we live in. And I think the end was that it didn't work, because the scalability, our life is more and more complex, right? Like you kind of have to know so much in order to just parse, which is no longer the case. Because here's a question, because I know the size of these things. Like a large language model looks to me like comes in at about a gig. Is that reasonable?
Well, it kind of depends, right? So a very small model is going to fit on your phone, right? And that's probably can answer, very basic questions. But, a very big model, it's probably gonna fit only on hardware that is, maybe $500,000, if not more, right? So we have to kind of.
I mean, this is just size. I mean, I have a JPEG that's a gig. You know what I mean? Like these are just kind of abstract sizes.
It's only, this is a GPU memory, right? This is only, like the size of the large language model, is kind of, so the size of the GPU, right? The GPU memory defines how big a large language model you can run, right?
Oh, okay. Well, I actually didn't know that. So hardware, this is just for paging problems or something like that, or like it has to have it all in memory in order for it to work?
Essentially. I mean, obviously you can subdivide, everything, but if you have an X amount of video memory, then that's your limitation, because this is all GPU computation, right? The large language model is just matrix multiplication at the end of the day, and it has to be implemented on a GPU, because only a GPU can handle this thing efficiently. I mean, obviously, you can, so, but right now,
and they're not multi-threaded, are they? Is that the problem?
Massively parallel, massively multi-threaded. That's kind of like the beauty of this thing. Obviously, you can probably run stuff on CPUs, right, a lot less efficiently, but the multi-threading is key here. Yeah.
Well, I guess what I was trying to get at is if you had your components in place, and each of those components is a choice or architecture you have to build, right? Like, let's just say you have to choose a model, or you have to choose a flavor of model. That's fine. And then it needs certain hardware in order to run, sort of, let's just say, like I can run my own stuff on my own machine right now, as can you. So a regular computer, let's call it, seems fine for the most part.
Like a gaming computer, like a good gaming computer will be probably a platform for pretty decent experimentation with a model that can really get you far, right? I mean, it's not going to be a model that is comparable to OpenAI's GPT-4, right? But still, it's going to be probably good for a lot of enterprise applications.
Well, then let's get to the second part, because it's interesting. Then you have a vectorized version of your files, right? Like something processes a set of files, and those are now mainly text is preferable, but you're saying at some point it'll try to figure out other things as well, right?
Yeah, so images will be vectorized as well. Graphs, all that stuff can be converted into vectors. Like at the end of the day, those are collections of pixels that can be represented as vectors, and videos can be represented as massive amounts of pixels represented as
Okay.
massive amounts of vectors, right? So yeah, we are getting there, no problem,
Okay, now we get to the
except for
hard
the
part. So now we've got
complexity.
a kind of unknown amount of stuff, right? So
Mhm,
it's no different probably than what Google's and others have contended with forever, right? Like it's a very messy world out there.
mhm.
The spidering of the internet, and
Yeah.
anything goes, right? But at the end of the day, you get a bunch of stuff, right? And then
Mhm.
you like you said, let's just call it vectorize it, right? Like you give it some
Yeah.
sort of digestible form, kind of like I'm gonna eat a sandwich in a minute, right? And sooner or
Mhm,
later we
mhm,
know what happens to that sandwich. It gets
mhm.
processed. So here's this processing, right? What I'm missing, and here's where. So then we have, let's say, I'm going to ask it, hey, show me a picture suitable for this presentation that we're going to make on how AI works.
Mhm.
Okay. And in
Mhm.
my mind, this is where it's important, right? In my
Mhm.
mind, I think it can be successful because I'm pretty sure that I've depicted something like this at some point. I just don't know
Mhm.
where it is. And once I see it, I'll recognize it because I created it, right?
Mhm.
So here's what I talk about. What I think is tricky about RAGs is the
Mhm.
vision. Most people don't have a vision that Google goes to whatever it goes through so that you can look up something like, hey, what did the Kansas City Chiefs win last night, right? Like it just assumes that it knows how to parse that with a correct-ish answer, right?
Yes, so there's several ways to do that, right? So if we are talking about multimodal, so let's say you have a
You can
question,
be
okay,
text if you want to. This is just to illustrate, like, how do you know? I guess what I mean is, how do you know when you get results back that are useful? Like, how do you know to pay Jack and Michael for setting all this up for you because it's fantastic? You see what I mean? Like, what does success look like when you've done this?
yes, so text is maybe easier
Yeah.
because it's the query is in the text and you vectorize text, right? So there is a connection, right? So you at the end of the day, you have question and then you have the context and it's
Yeah.
textual and it's retrieves text. Now with video, like with images, right? Like let's say I'm building a presentation to your point, right? Maybe it's going to be about computers, and now the question will be, okay, just find me a nice picture of a computer in my files, right, or in the repository, or something, right? So now how there's several ways we can do that, right? So let's say we vectorize pictures. We can vectorize them in a way that during the vectorization process, the AI actually recognizes what is in those pictures. So the vectors will come up with a metadata that will basically enumerate the content of the picture. So it will be, on the picture there was a
Hmm.
monitor, and a PC kind of tower, right? And there's a mouse and there's a keyboard, right? So the vectorization process will use its own AI to actually itemize the items that are in the picture. So then the retrieval is going to happen actually on the textual level, because the prompt will look at the metadata for the picture and retrieve whatever was relevant, right? So that's kind of like one way of doing this, right? Another way of doing this is to kind of okay, so here's a collection of pictures. I'm gonna send it to the large language model that has vision capabilities, and the vision capabilities in the large language model will get me the most relevant picture. It will basically do like an image recognition. It will be a slow process, right? So I wouldn't call it RAG, right? It would be kind of like an intelligent image recognition when you are submitting. But that part can be done offline as well as a training process or whatever. So no matter what happens, somebody has to recognize that the picture, the matrix of pixels in the picture have some entities, recognizable entities that exist in them. So if your question is retrieve a picture, not generate a picture, right? Because we are not talking about another generative process which generates a picture of a computer that you wanted, right? So we are talking about those other kind of systems, right? But if
you worked for Grainger, for example, I could assume that you could somehow ask it for a picture or a diagram of part number 37 or whatever, like, you know what I mean? In huge databases like that, free text search tends to be brittle, right? Because you tend not to know all the taxonomies that people invent to be able to find stuff, right? And that's what I teach. Can this be better at it? This is another HCI question.
So you would vectorize your taxonomy, right? So you would have those pictures that maybe exist in folders, right? So you will know maybe the name of the folder that gives you whatever, right? So as long as we can kind of have a description of the picture that is in an embedding vector in RAG, then you can do that, right? So but there is no miracles here, right? At some point.
No, this is the thing. This is so non-miraculous that I just want to make sure. What is the vectorized thing called? Like, that's a file, right? It's something called .xyz, isn't it? I mean,
it's basically just a string of numbers, right?
Does it have a file type or special file?
It's going to be sitting in a vector database, so it's going to be a row in a database that you can search against.
So it's a CSV or something.
Basically, you can blob or whatever, right? So it's going to be
so it's a blob of stuff that is. I was trying to get at the size here. So depending upon what you're training it on, I'm assuming it's bigger.
Yeah. So 1024 bits, will get you Google level quality of retrieval from huge repositories, right? But again, let's not forget that some AI needed to recognize what's in the picture that was transcribed into text. Text is vectorized, and now you can search against it, and then you will have an association with the picture. So if the question is find me a picture that exists, that is the process, right? And can be RAG. Now, if the question is generate a picture for me based on, whatever my preferences, right? So I like yellow computers with green keyboards, right? Then we are talking about the generative process that creates a pixel matrix that answers the question, and that is not a RAG process, right? That's a separate generative solution that we already know about, right? About those services.
So if I'm understanding, there is a really good guardrail around this problem that people have of unstructured data, right? Which is everyone has this problem, especially businesses. Every business I've worked in, it's a very challenging job to structure data properly, right? And it has to be maintained, and has to be continued to be useful, which it goes out of date. It is definitely a thing. That usually isn't part of marketing, which is often also something that is very temporal, right? Like there aren't forever marketing campaigns because you have a new product and the old product is no longer available, and so on and so forth. So there's all these changes that happen, and that institutional memory is something that people are pretty good at, right? I was there for the launch of the Newton at Apple. I know some people that were there, and who even remembers this stuff, right?
Well, people are pretty good about it, but sharing that, or eliciting that knowledge that's a problem. So
learning from it is what I was getting at, right? Like, what did you learn from your experiences launching? Whatever, beta, alpha, so on and so forth, right? And that institutional knowledge can be in Jira, it can be in a Confluence page. I mean, I found these things everywhere. It can be in a deck that I did, right? Like that's where I put my things because I usually have to present things. So I'm just saying that, is that stuff useful even as vectors, right? Or should we just skip to generating new stuff? Like maybe there is no inherent value in training in all of this ephemera, right? Like if you had a Salesforce database and you had me in it and you keep calling me, like, do you need to know more about me or more about, my world in order to see that I'm just not responding to your messages, right?
That's a great question. And I think, there's going to be like probably less and less value in that old stuff that we think that we really need to vectorize, because the new large language models will be getting closer and closer to AGI, right? Artificial general intelligence, right? So they may not be exactly more knowledgeable about everything, but for sure they will be more consistent. They will be more logical. They will be more planning wise, organized, right? So chances are that all those emails that exist in organizations, from decades, and then maybe old PowerPoints that are outdated already, maybe that's just noise, right? Maybe
right.
Maybe what we need to have is just those very strong large language models that will just look at something that is very recent, and then kind of, okay, so here's the plan, how do we do this, right? Here's the plan, how do we do better? So, to your point, like define a concept for the AI that you want to achieve, like, hey, there's something fraudulent, right? Chances are that the AI may already have like 100 of definitions in it of fraudulent behaviors. So it's just going to be, okay, so here's a list of what exists, in the fraudulent, behavior world, right? And now we're going to start picking things and analyzing those dimensions. So yeah, so that, to your point, I think there's probably something to it that, maybe this old legacy data is kind of less and less of a, kind of an issue, because maybe if you are working for logistics companies or marketing companies and you are predicting using behaviors, then maybe, all those things are changing, and maybe you need just kind of recent data, to kind of get going. So yeah, that's an interesting question.
No, and thank you for kind of clarifying quite a bit around what I still find is like the allure of something is this. Well, allure is always laziness, right? Like that you can get away with doing less, and there is something really inherently exciting about AGI, as it's very good at creating a lot with little. However, its training is suspect. Its training, at least for me, in imagery, is so consistently frustrating that I just give up after a while, right? Like, unless you want everything to look like a Frank Frazetta book cover, it seems the training ground is really brittle, right? So I keep thinking, well, I have maybe 200 to 300 art books here. If I could sit here, digitalize them all, could I train it in what things look like? Or again, am I just wasting my time in it? And like you just said, maybe it's just a matter of the prompt, or the subtlety is probably more in the prompt. And that's why I was looking at a job description for a prompt engineer the other day, and I was like, seriously, like, give me, like, seriously, like how could that be a thing, already, right? Like,
well, it's tremendously exciting. I mean, if you remember the second Space Odyssey movie, the 2010, the big part of the movie was that there was another HAL on Earth, and there was the scientist, and it was talking to HAL, the one on the brother, the clone that existed on Earth, and it was kind of like having a conversation with that AI, kind of trying to kind of elicit answers. Kind of like that. So prompt engineering is kind of having that conversation with an intelligent system. So I would consider this to be like one of the coolest things on Earth, nowadays, right? Because I'm kind of a sci-fi kind of person. But
I didn't say it was a bad job. I just the quantifiable effect of it is puzzling, right? Because it's sort of like QA. I always think of QA as something I would love to automate, right? Because people are very bad at writing tests for their code, and code is, it's all very brittle and so on and so forth, right? Or you get some feedback, right? Which is someone saying like, hey, you really didn't think this through. This quality assurance is so ingrained into most processes that it just seems ripe to be able to automate it. And I've been working with teams for my whole career. Automating it is incredibly challenging, like you said, because you're not talking to an intelligent system. You're talking to a whole bunch of people that made something, and then you're trying to ask them like, well, did you make this right? Like, well, this is a beyond belief complex manufacturing process, right? And weirdly enough, it just seems to work. I don't know what they do. They may plug it in and say, okay, that seems to work, and there you go. Like, we don't have any defects in our procedural process, so therefore we don't expect a lot to go wrong, and therefore QA is then like a rubber stamp, right? Approved.
Yeah.
Anyway,
the QA in the RAG, right? So maybe to your point,
QA
right,
to
on
HAL is what I was getting at, right?
Yeah.
Like,
So
how do you QA HAL?
Yeah. So right now, right, if you start talking without context with a large language model, you ask the same question 3 times, and chances are that maybe you will get 3 different answers. Maybe sometimes, significantly different, right? But if you have a RAG available to you, then it means that with your question, there's always going to be a contextual package attached to it. And then you will be a lot more consistent because the large language model will kind of settle on the context, the meaning of the context, right? So I think in that respect, that the process of prompting and eliciting, responses is kind of something that it can be QA'd. I think because because you have a lot more control. But on the other hand, in automation, right? Like if you think about using AI for automation processes in manufacturing, so what's happening right now is people are using large language models for those islands of automation. So you have a robot somewhere. Okay, I'm going to program the robot, right? So this is now happening. Now the next thing, and there's already companies that are doing this, is that okay, so now we have all these companies, all those islands of automation, in the production line, like Henry Ford, right? Like, here's stage number 1, stage number 2. There's a conveyor belt, right? So now the next thing will be okay. So now each of those robots will have its own large language model that is capable of talking to everything else. So now they will not have to be like 100,000% compatible systems connected to some sort of a single network. It's just going to be like now maybe a conversation between pieces of automation along the conveyor belt. So this is potentially a huge deal for the manufacturing, kind of renewal of manufacturing because of the, unfortunately very, very high labor costs, right? But if you can have relatively a painless solution for automating, construction or manufacturing a widget, then it's going to be a huge deal.
Well, once again, I hope this didn't stretch too far for you, but I think that's a really nice nugget to share, right? Because I still think these guardrails are very and I don't even want to call them guardrails, because that could be another discussion, right? About how you legislate any of this stuff, right? Like what is good and bad in order to say, for example, most companies are very much interested in security, right? They don't want their private ideas and things to be seen by others than those that have a need to, and a lot of security is based around you just don't get to see it, right? Like it isn't based upon hey, you can get this much out of it, it exists, now here, go ask for permission, right? It's more like you get it all or you get nothing, which from a user experience is gets people to well, they go along with nothing, right? So there's some really, again, there's always this great clash, in terms of the people's role, the people's need to understand what good and bad outputs are, I think is interesting, right? Because, all I can say is I want to pause, I want to share this. And I think it's great stuff as always, Jack, and you've taught me a lot on this. So for our next conversation, we'll pick up the thread.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, very good questions.
All right, cheers.